And we are back with Final Fantasy Misconceptions. What's good, my fellow peasants? How are you all doing? Now, this is a bit of a random video coming out of nowhere, but I really wanted to cover this one because it's one of the most interesting misconceptions, and in fact one of my favourite aspects of Final Fantasy VIII, and why it's one of my top Final Fantasy games. And that is the story and the dynamics of the sorceresses. Now, we know there's quite a few of them. There's Ultimecia, there's Adele, there's Adele, there's, spoiler alert, Renoa, and there's been many other candidates to boot, but the most interesting of all of them, in my personal opinion, is actually the one who gets most overlooked, and I feel it's mostly because of misconceptions about who she was and what she did, and that is Adele. No, not that kind of Adele. I'm talking about Tetsuya Nomura designed Adele. Bone-chillingly horrifying Adele, supposed to be a female, that has the upper torso and muscle mass of a man, Adele. I have a really weird boner right now, Adele. Wait, what? And I want to cover this character because she's one of my favourites, and the misconceptions around her character really goes hand in hand with the misconceptions around the communication issue that is in the world of FF8. The unnamed world, yes indeed, it actually has no name. Not quite sure why it doesn't, but it doesn't. And the communication issue of what I'm talking about is that no one can send any wireless communications. Telephone, be it via TV, be it internet, Bluetooth connected wine bottles, bright grills, water cap fountains, internet connected belts, or smart trash cans. Oh, and a frying pan. And smart socks. Oh god, they've actually made this is a thing, guys. Bluetooth connected socks. Why? So, wireless technology and communications, it isn't a thing in this seemingly modern looking universe, and that's a pretty important detail because it dictates a hell of a lot of what happens in the story. It's the entire reason why they need runners, messengers on missions like in the Dalek Siege to actually run messages personally, because they don't have wireless communications, and this goes on throughout the game and it affects the story. So like when Cid sends Fuyin and Rajan off to deliver new orders for our party, it's why Squall and the gang have to personally go to Balam Garden to warn them of the upcoming missile crisis, because they can't get word in advance. In fact, the only type of communication that really works in this universe is anything that's not wireless. So to do that, it has to all be via cable, and the only people who have done that is the Galbadian Empire. And this is why it's important, because even one of the first missions we do is to go into Dolet and to take down the communication tower. That's because the Galbadian Empire, the big bad mean boys, they've created a way to communicate, and communication in this world with such a lack thereof is quite a powerful thing. Now, their type of communication isn't wireless, it still is canonical. What they've actually created is something called a HD cable, which is quite a laughably ironic name considering that actually means something in the real world. But in terms of FF8, HD cable, we don't actually know the meaning, but it probably means high distance cable. Because of Adele, wireless doesn't work, so it actually has to be a wired connection, and they kind of spoke about that, how it was a cable that kept getting interrupted and it wasn't a great form of communication. Monsters kept breaking the wire, so they're literally having to like stream huge cables across the world to communicate. Ridiculously long cables that, when cut, leave the enemy in communication blackout, and we do take advantage of that throughout the game. But why is it Adele? What is she doing? Why is she causing it? Why is she such a Dancarino villain? Well, I'm going to do my best, absolute best, to explain a pretty complicated plot point via the medium of dance. No, I'm just kidding, it isn't really. So Adele, the causer, the origin of the worldwide radio interference. And I just want to point out, no one knows where the origins of this interference come from. You can speak to certain members of the Balam Garden, the students, and they kind of hint about it and talk about it, but they don't make a big deal out of it because it's just commonplace at this point. It's just part of the norm. For example, Squall, in his entire lifetime, being that he's 17 years old, he's never known what wireless communication is. So for most everybody, it's just become the norm, even though the world once had it. And it's 17 years ago that this worldwide interference came from, and it was when Adele was imprisoned. And the story goes something like this. Adele, she was the sorceress, she was the leading power in Esther, and she ruled with an iron fist, she ruled with fear, she ruled as a tyrant. Just about as bad as it gets now. Her rise to power isn't much known about, although I think you could probably guess she's a sorceress, and the time period is also unknown. It's said that it's sometime between the destruction of the Central Empire, which was an empire 4,000 years previously, and the advent of the Sorceress's War, which is what Adele started, which was around Laguna's era, back when he was a young lad. So it's sometime in between there. Now, some people have taken that as a jump to say that Adele was 4,000 years old. We don't actually know that to be true. In fact, one of the things that actually crapped on the Ultra Messiah is Renoa theory, is that the story writer actually came out and said that sorceresses don't live abnormal lifespans. They actually live the same lifespans as a normal human being, but that doesn't take into account things like cryosleep. They put Adele in an artificial sleep if she doesn't age during that period, so there are ways to do it. And this is a game where time and reality can be twisted and bended and manipulated, so I don't know how I feel about that little quote. Whether that totally disregards the Renoa is Ultra Messiah theory. All I'm going to say is that Square Enix, they toyed with the idea, they tantalised with it in the old Dissidia when they had Ultra Messiah ask for one more dance from Squall. Yeah, you was either majorly taking the piss or pointing out the very obvious theory that a lot of people have. And this is kind of why I want a remake, to see things like this approached at different angles and explained and explored, and something like this with Adele, because after she ruled, God knows how long, as a tyrant, a resistance rose up, a resistance in the form of Laguna and his two buddies, Kiros and Ward. Now, what inspired Laguna to stand up against Adele and stop it was because Adele at this point was looking for another host to pass down her powers. That's what a sorceress has to do, infect a new host and make sure the power of the sorceresses continue. They either get to pick, or if they die, it will pass on regardless. So in this particular case, Adele wanted to pick her own successor, one who would continue her rule of tyranny. And one particular candidate that stood out to her was Alone. Alone had special powers, and today in this universe, she's about the only one who can actually send a wireless communication, because she can actually transfer her consciousness to communicate with somebody she knows. She can even go one step further, she can then send their consciousness back in time, and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. So that's why Adele really took an interest in Alone, but when her parents refused to hand her over, they got gunned down and killed. That's when Alone became an orphan. She went to live with the neighbour was Rain, and then Laguna, he met Rain after he was injured, got strong feelings for her, got strong feelings for Alone. That was all after the whole thing with Julie. Being Renoa's mum, who kind of asked Laguna back to her hotel, random man. She was a bit of a hoe, I ain't gonna lie, but then Laguna got nervous, he couldn't get it up, they didn't go through with it. That whole thing is just a crazy weird dynamic. So anyway, Laguna decides he's gonna stop this rule of tyranny. That's exactly what he does, and he does it through, in good old Laguna fashion, by a bit of derping trollage and trickery. The plan was simple, and by simple I mean incredibly complicated and dangerous and crazy as hell. They actually hijacked Adele's most prized possession, which was the lunatic Pandora. Now, this was a weapon that Adele used to terrorize the world, and a quick description of what that is. The lunatic Pandora, it was originally a crystal called the Crystal Pillar. It's been on the Earth for a long time, no one knows exactly how long, but it's sending a strong directional signal to the moon. That's why they speculate it originally came from the moon, and that's why it has like this harmonious signal going on. And when the moon is in just the right place and the signal hits just the right frequency, it will cause something called the lunar cry. Now, the lunar cry is when the monsters come pouring down from the moon onto the planet. A really awesome and dope explanation of why there are these monsters on the planet of FFVIII. It doesn't happen that often, but it's from previous lunar cries. But what Adele did to turn this into terror is she actually took the crystal and turned it into the lunatic Pandora, which was basically like a metal casing where she could actually move it around. And because she could move the crystal around, she could align it with the moon whenever she wanted. So basically she could cause a lunar cry whenever she wanted, and that was the terror, was that Adele could bring down hordes of monsters from the moon at her whim. So shit the bed. things are pretty serious now. An interesting detail and actually helped design the lunatic Pandora was Dr. Odine. Now, Dr. Odine is a pretty key figure because he was actually a servant of Adele and he was really resistant to betraying Adele. And he kind of helped join the party later on, but he first turned his allegiance for Laguna, and he helped Laguna create the technology that they used to then trick Adele and capture her. Now, the way they actually did it was hijack the lunatic Pandora. They then sunk it into the bottom of the ocean, which was both to draw out Adele and to lessen the impact of future lunar crises. Two birds with one stone. My man Laguna. When Adele came to investigate, they actually had Alone there. Now, it wasn't really Alone, he didn't put the little girl in danger, he just had a hologram of her, and of course that was a tempting piece of bait for Adele because she was considering Alone to be her next apprentice successor. But Adele quickly realised it was a hologram. She even said, "You thought I would fall for that trick." But little did she know she had walked straight into the sly fox Laguna's plan. And bouncing from his false position of worship and adoration, he shoved the evil sorceress Adele back a few steps, and that was when Kyros could activate. It was called a cryo-containment device. It actually says that a gelatinous cooling and buffering agent. The device protected the frozen Adele from the outside contact, preventing any stimulus from awakening her. It was also a way to dampen her powers, but it only dampened, it didn't fully silence them. No, so what do they do with this captured Adele? I mean, do they kill her? Well, again, even if she hasn't passed down her powers directly, the sorceress's power will just go onto someone else, which they don't want, so they have to somehow keep this crazy bitch, he bitch, man bitch, I don't even know I mean, the gender is female. I just can't get over him. She's got bigger pecs than me. So what they decide to do instead, because they don't want to kill her and she can't be down on the earth either, is they fire her up on sort of the Ragnarok ships, or there was three of them, but one of the Ragnarok ships, it was to take the Adele's tomb / sorceress's memorial. It would get called the Adele's tomb once it was actually launched into space, and it would be brought into orbit around the moon as kind of this eternal prison. And that is what is causing the worldwide interference. There's the origins of it. For 17 years, mankind has given up its wireless communications and technology, all to imprison this sorceress, and that's what I just think is so fantastic about it. They've created this space prison to keep this villain locked, and with all of her backstory and her story of tyranny and her significance on the plot, that's why I like Adele as much of a villain. This is why, when we're on the Ragnarok, for example, when the first ever wireless communication happens in the game, it takes Squall by surprise. The lunar base was never a scientific base there to observe the moon, that was just the ruse, that was the guise. It was actually there to observe Adele's tomb, ensure that she stayed in prison, so damn, these villains had an entire space station built around her. And that's a wrap, guys. That's why there's communication blackout. That's Adele's influence. That's the level of crazy in this story, and that's why they had to have runners. That there were times in the story where just a simple phone call or a text message would have saved the day. Times like when they was trapped in the prison or trapped in the airbase, or where they had to physically run to other gardens. It was like Trabia Garden, where all the seeds literally died because they couldn't call for help. There's the misconception, and there's the story. A dark, tyrannical, and utterly malevolent sorceress whose rule of terror force mankind to give up their communications, their TV, their radio. A dark cloud constantly hovering above mankind, and they really made you feel it in the game, especially even with little errors, although it was subtle. Things like the TV screen in Timber. If you squint real close, you will see words like, "I am still alive," and "I will never let you forget about me." Adele is truly terrifying. Until the next video, go out!